The old theater smelled like dust and disappointment. 8 hours. That's how long Harold Steinberg had been sitting in the same red velvet seat, watching one kid after another walk across the stage and butcher perfectly good music. His back hurt, his eyes burned, and his patience had run out somewhere around contestant number 37. How many more? He groaned, rubbing his temples. Patricia Wells, his assistant for the past 15 years, flipped through her clipboard. Just one more, Harold. Then we can go home. Thank God. He slumped deeper into his seat. I swear, if I hear one more kid play for Elise like they're typing on a computer keyboard, I'm going to lose it. The Manhattan School of Performing Arts held these auditions every year. Same story, different faces. Rich kids with expensive teachers who could play all the right notes but had no soul. Stage parents hovering in the wings, living through their children. Harold had seen it all. After 40 years in the business, nothing surprised him anymore. This last one's different, Patricia said, scanning the application form. They're all different, Harold muttered. Let me guess. Started playing at age 3? Won some local competition? Parents spent $50,000 on lessons? No, actually. Patricia's voice had an odd tone to it. This kid, no formal training at all, learned from watching videos at the public library. Harold snorted. Oh, wonderful. Another self-taught genius. What's he playing? Chopsticks? Patricia hesitated. Rachmaninoff's Third. The coffee cup stopped halfway to Harold's mouth. He turned to look at her, certain he'd misheard. I'm sorry, what? Piano Concerto No. 3. That's what he wrote down. For a moment, Harold just stared. Then he burst out laughing. Not a polite chuckle, but a full, deep belly laugh that echoed through the empty theater. The stage crew looked over, surprised. Harold Steinberg never laughed during auditions. Rach 3? He wheezed, wiping his eyes. A self-taught kid from the library wants to play Rach 3? That's like saying you learned brain surgery from YouTube. Patricia didn't smile. Harold, maybe we should... No, this is perfect. He was still chuckling. Best joke I've heard all day. Rach 3. Do you know how many professional pianists can't play that piece? It's a monster. 20,000 notes. 40 minutes of pure technical hell. Rachmaninoff himself had hands like baseball mitts, and even he struggled with it. The side door creaked open. A small figure walked in, barely visible in the dim stage lights. Harold squinted. The kid couldn't be more than 12. Skinny arms poking out of a suit jacket that was clearly borrowed, too big in the shoulders, too long in the sleeves. His pants were hemmed but still dragged at the heels, scuffed sneakers that had seen better days. Oh, this is precious, Harold whispered to Patricia. Look at him. He probably doesn't even know what he signed up for. The boy walked to center stage with an odd confidence, neither rushed nor hesitant. He had dark hair that stuck up in places, like he'd tried to comb it down but given up halfway through. His face was calm, almost serene, which struck Harold as strange. Most kids were nervous wrecks by this point. Name? Harold called out, not bothering to hide his amusement. Lee Wei, the boy answered. His voice was quiet but clear, with just a trace of an accent. And you're really planning to play Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto? Yes, sir. Harold leaned back, spreading his arms across the seats beside him. Tell me, Lee Wei, where exactly did you learn this piece? At the community center, sir, and the library. The library. Harold repeated it slowly, savoring the absurdity. And how long have you been playing piano? 3 years. The laughter came again, harder this time. Harold actually had to catch his breath. 3 years. Patricia, did you hear that? 3 years. He raised his voice so the stage crew could hear. This kid thinks he can play Rach 3 after 3 years of teaching himself at the library. Some of the crew members snickered. One of them shook his head and went back to coiling cables. They'd all seen Harold destroy pretentious kids before, but this seemed almost cruel. Lee Wei stood perfectly still, waiting. Tell you what, Harold said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. If this kid can actually play Rachmaninoff's Third, really play it, not just bang through the first few bars, I'll sink right through this chair. I'll sink through the floor and straight down to the basement. Hell, I'll sink all the way to China. More laughter from the crew. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. "Harold, please." "No, I'm serious." He was enjoying himself now. "In fact, if he can play even 5 minutes of real Rach 3, I'll personally pay for him to go to any music school he wants. How's that?" The boy didn't react to any of this. He simply walked to the piano bench, adjusted its height carefully, and sat down. His feet barely reached the pedals. He had to sit on the edge of the bench to manage it. "This is going to be painful," Harold muttered. "Like watching a car crash in slow motion." Li Wei placed his hands on his lap and closed his eyes. The theater grew quiet. Even the crew stopped working, sensing something was about to happen, though they weren't sure what. Harold pulled out his phone, ready to text his wife that he'd be home soon. This would be over in 30 seconds. The kid would fumble through the opening, realize he was in over his head, and they could all go home. Another year, another batch of mediocre talents. Nothing new under the sun. "Whenever you're ready," Harold called out, not looking up from his phone. Li Wei lifted his hands to the keys. They looked so small against the massive piano, like a child's, toys against real tools. Harold started typing his message. "Leaving soon. Last kid is a joke. Want Chinese for dinner?" Then the first note rang out. Harold's thumb froze over the send button. That wasn't what he expected. The note was clean, precise, with a weight behind it that shouldn't come from such small hands. Then came the second note, and the third, and suddenly the opening cascade of Rachmaninoff's Third was filling the theater. Not the hesitant, careful picking that Harold expected, but a full, rich sound that seemed impossible from a 12-year-old. Harold's phone slipped from his hand, clattering onto the floor. He didn't notice. The boy's hands were moving now, really moving, dancing across the keys with a fluidity that took Harold's breath away. This wasn't just someone playing the notes. This was someone who understood them, who felt them, who had somehow found the soul of the piece and was pulling it out of the piano like a magician, pulling silk scarves from thin air. "Holy," one of the stage crew whispered. Harold couldn't speak. He sat forward, gripping the armrest, watching those small hands do the impossible. The kid wasn't just playing Rachmaninoff's Third, he was owning it. Every phrase, every dynamic, every subtle shift in tempo, it was all there. Patricia glanced at Harold. His mouth was slightly open, his eyes wide. In 15 years, she'd never seen him look like this. The music continued to pour out, filling every corner of the old theater. It bounced off the walls, wrapped around the pillars, floated up to the painted ceiling where cherubs danced in faded gold. Li Wei swayed slightly as he played, lost in the music, his oversized jacket moving with him like a cape. Harold realized he was holding his breath. He forced himself to exhale, to blink, to remember where he was. But he couldn't look away. He couldn't move. He felt like he really was sinking, not through the chair, but into something else, into the music, into a moment he knew he'd remember for the rest of his life, because this wasn't supposed to happen. Kids from community centers with no training weren't supposed to play like this. The world didn't work that way. There were rules, hierarchies, proper channels. You studied with the right teachers, went to the right schools, had the right connections. That's how it worked, but Li Wei didn't know the rules. Or maybe he just didn't care. As the music soared toward the end of the first movement, Harold Steinberg, the man who'd heard it all and seen it all, felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them away furiously. He had a reputation to maintain. But deep down, in a place he'd thought was dead after 40 years in this business, something stirred, something that remembered why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. 3 years earlier, Li Wei stood outside the St. Augustine Community Center, pressing his nose against the cold glass door. It was raining, one of those heavy November storms that turned the streets into rivers. His parents wouldn't be done at the restaurant for another 4 hours, and the library had closed early for repairs. He'd never been inside the community center before. It looked warm and dry, which was really all that mattered. He pushed the door. Locked. Of course. "Hey, kid." Li Wei jumped. A man in a janitor's uniform stood behind him, holding a ring of keys that jangled like wind chimes. He was older, maybe, 60, with gray hair and kind eyes behind thick glasses. "You lost?" the man asked. "No, sir, just waiting." "In the rain?" Li Wei shrugged. The man studied him for a moment, then sighed and unlocked the door. "Come on. You can wait inside. Just don't touch anything." The community center smelled like floor wax and old books. Li Wei followed the janitor through hallways lined with bulletin boards covered in flyers for yoga classes, bingo nights, and food drives. They passed a gymnasium where the squeaks of basketball shoes echoed off the walls. "I'm Mr. Rodriguez," the man said. "I pretty much run this place. Well, I clean it anyway. Same thing." "I'm Li Wei. Chinese? Taiwanese? Ah, how long you been here?" 2 years. Mr. Rodriguez nodded like that explained everything. Maybe it did. He led Li Wei to a small room with plastic chairs and a table covered in ancient magazines. "You can wait here. I'll be around if you need anything." Li Wei sat down, but the chair was uncomfortable and the magazines were all about gardening. After 5 minutes, he started exploring, not touching anything, just looking. That's when he heard it. Music. Faint, barely there, like someone humming in another room. He followed the sound down a staircase he probably shouldn't have gone down, through a door that was supposed to be locked but wasn't quite latched. The basement was dim and musty. Boxes were stacked against the walls, forgotten holiday decorations, and old sports equipment, and there in the corner, covered by a paint-splattered drop cloth, was the source of the sound. Li Wei pulled off the cloth and gasped. A piano. An old upright. Its wood scarred and faded. Keys yellowed like old teeth. But it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. One of the keys was pressed down, stuck, creating that faint hum he'd heard. He touched it gently, and it popped back, up with a little plink. He'd seen pianos before, of course. In movies, in the mall, through the windows of the music store he passed on his way to school. But he'd never been this close to one. Never been alone with one. He pressed a key. The sound filled the basement, bounced off the concrete walls, wrapped around him like a blanket. He pressed another, then another. Each note was a tiny miracle, a piece of magic he could create with just a finger. "What are you doing down here?" Li Wei spun around. Mr. Rodriguez stood on the stairs, but he didn't look angry, just surprised. "I'm sorry, I heard music and... You play?" "No. I mean, I've never... No." Mr. Rodriguez came down the stairs slowly, his knees creaking almost as much as the steps. He looked at the piano, then at Li Wei. "This old thing's been down here for years. Lady donated it when she retired, said it was too expensive to move." He ran a hand along the top, dust dancing in the weak light from the single bulb overhead. "Nobody ever comes down here." "It's beautiful," Li Wei said. Mr. Rodriguez laughed. "Beautiful? It's half dead. Listen." He played a scale. 3 of the keys made no sound at all. 2 others buzzed like angry bees. "Probably should just throw it out." "No." The word came out louder than Li Wei intended. "I mean, would it be okay if I came back, just to look at it?" The old janitor studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single key on a shoelace. "Back door," he said, pressing it into Li Wei's hand. "After school, before 6, and if anyone asks, you're helping me clean. Got it?" Li Wei nodded so hard his neck hurt. That night he couldn't sleep. He kept feeling the weight of the key in his hand, the smooth surface of the piano keys under his fingers. The next day at school dragged on forever. Math class felt like it lasted a year. When the final bell rang, he ran the entire 8 blocks to the community center. The basement was exactly as he'd left it. The piano waited patiently, like an old friend. Li Wei sat on the rickety bench and placed his hands on the keys the way he'd seen people do in movies. He had no idea what he was doing, but that didn't matter. He pressed keys randomly at first, listening to each sound, learning which combinations sounded good together and which ones sounded like cats fighting. He stayed until 5:45, then ran home just in time to meet his parents at the restaurant. This became his routine. every day without fail. His parents thought he was at the library studying. In a way, he was studying, just not what they imagined. After a week of random playing, Li Wei realized he needed help. The library had books on piano, but they were full of strange symbols and Italian words he didn't understand. The videos on the library computers were better. He could watch someone's hands, pause, replay, memorize. He started with simple songs. Mary Had a Little Lamb took him 3 days to figure out. Happy Birthday took a week. But each song taught him something new. How to make his fingers work independently. How to read the patterns in the keys. How to hear a melody in his head and find it on the piano. The broken keys became a challenge, then a game. He learned to play around them, to adjust songs to avoid the dead notes. It made him creative, forced him to think differently. When he finally saved enough money to buy a beginner's book from a garage sale, he realized he was already past most of it. 6 months in, Mr. Rodriguez came down to listen. Li Wei played a simple Mozart piece he'd learned from a YouTube video, transposing it to avoid the broken keys. "Where'd you learn that?" Mr. Rodriguez asked. "The library computer. You can watch videos for free if you have a library card." The old man shook his head in amazement. "My grandmother would have loved you. She played piano in Cuba before she couldn't anymore." Li Wei wanted to ask what happened, but Mr. Rodriguez was already heading back upstairs. By the end of the first year, Li Wei could play dozens of songs. Pop songs, classical pieces, even some jazz he'd discovered by accident. His fingers had grown stronger, more precise. He could reach an octave now, barely, by stretching until it hurt. The second year, he discovered Rachmaninoff. It was an accident, really. He'd clicked the wrong video at the library. Instead of the Chopin nocturne he'd wanted, something else started playing. The music was like nothing he'd ever heard. Complex, demanding, almost angry in places, then suddenly tender. It was too hard, obviously, impossibly hard. But Li Wei had learned something about impossible things. They were only impossible until they weren't. He found every recording he could, different pianists, different interpretations. He watched their hands, studied their movements. At home, he practiced finger exercises on the kitchen table while his parents watched TV. At school, he tapped out rhythms on his desk until teachers told him to stop. The third movement was the hardest. Thousands of notes running passages that seemed to go on forever. On a good piano, it would have been challenging enough. On the community center's broken piano, it was like trying to run a marathon in flip-flops. But Li Wei didn't know any better. He didn't know that what he was doing was supposed to be impossible. He just knew that when he really played, the rest of the world went away. The tiny apartment, his parents' exhaustion, the kids at school who laughed at his accent. None of it mattered. Down in that basement, with Mr. Rodriguez's mop bucket in the corner and mice scratching in the walls, Li Wei found something that was entirely his own. Something nobody could take away. He practiced that concerto every day for a year. By the time he saw the flyer for the Manhattan School of Performing Arts audition, posted on the community center bulletin board, he could play it with his eyes closed. Mr. Rodriguez found him staring at the flyer. "You thinking about it?" The old man asked. "It costs $50 just to audition. So I don't have $50. Mr. Rodriguez was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out his wallet, counted out 2 20s and a 10, and pushed them into Li Wei's hand. "Yes, you do." The music pouring from Li Wei's fingers wasn't just sound. It was a story. Each note carried weight, history, struggle. Harold Steinberg sat frozen in his seat, watching the impossible unfold before him. The boys' technique was all wrong. Everything they taught at the prestigious schools, everything Harold had learned in his 40 years, Li Wei was breaking all those rules. His hand position was too flat. His shoulders hunched forward when they should be back. He was using fingerings that no classical teacher would ever approve. But none of that mattered. Because the music. God, the music. Patricia had pulled out her phone and was recording. Her hands shook slightly. In 15 years working with Harold, she'd never seen him this quiet, this still. He usually spent auditions scribbling notes, checking his watch, sighing dramatically. Now he sat like a statue, barely breathing. Up, in the lighting booth, Tommy, who'd been running lights for the theater for 20 years, had stopped packing up his equipment. He stood at the window looking down at the small figure on the stage. "You hearing this?" he whispered to his assistant. "I'm hearing it. Not believing it, but hearing it." The first movement was coming to its climax, a section that required enormous hand stretches, rapid octave passages that even adult pianists struggled with. Li Wei's small hands shouldn't have been able to manage it, but he'd found a way. He rolled the chords instead of playing them simultaneously, used the pedal to connect notes his fingers couldn't reach, created illusions of sound that somehow worked better than the original. Harold leaned forward even more. The boy was rewriting Rachmaninoff, not out of arrogance but out of necessity. He was like water finding its way through cracks, adapting, flowing, always moving forward. The stage crew had completely stopped working now. 5 grown men stood, in the wings, holding cables and lights, transfixed. One of them, Big Mike they called him, a guy who usually listened to nothing but heavy metal, had tears running down his face. "My daughter plays piano," he whispered to nobody in particular. "She's been taking lessons for 5 years. Costs us $300 a month. She can't play anything like this." As Li Wei transitioned into the second movement, Harold's mind raced. How was this possible? The fingering, the memory work alone. This piece had over 20,000 notes. Professional pianists spent months, sometimes years, preparing it. This kid had learned it where? In a community center? From videos? The second movement was gentler, more lyrical but no less demanding. It required a different kind of skill, not just technical prowess but emotional maturity. How did a 12-year-old understand the longing in those passages? The regret? The bittersweet memories that Rachmaninoff had woven into every phrase? But watching Li Wei's face, Harold began to understand. The boy's eyes were closed, but tears squeezed out from under his lashes. This wasn't just music to him. This was everything. Every lonely afternoon, every moment of feeling different, every time someone looked at his second-hand clothes and dismissed him, it was all there in the music. Patricia noticed something else. "Harold," she whispered, "look at his shoes." Harold looked. The soles of Li Wei's sneakers were worn through on one side. He could see his sock. The boy had literally walked holes in his shoes, probably from walking to wherever he practiced every day. "His application," Patricia continued quietly, flipping through papers. "Parents work at Golden Dragon Restaurant, 14-hour days. Addresses. Harold, they live in a 1-bedroom apartment, family of 3 in 1 bedroom." Harold felt something twist in his chest. He thought of his own grandson taking piano lessons in a climate-controlled studio with a $50,000 Steinway, complaining about having to practice for 30 minutes a day. The third movement began, the famous finale, the one that broke pianists' spirits and fingers alike. It was relentless, nearly 15 minutes of technical complexity that never let. Harold had heard it performed by the greatest pianist in the world, Vladimir Horowitz, Martha Argerich, Lang Lang. None of them had made him feel like this, because those pianists had been showing off their skill, their mastery. Li Wei wasn't showing off. He was surviving. Each passage was a mountain he had to climb, and you could see the effort, the determination, the absolute refusal to give up. Halfway through the movement, disaster struck. Li Wei hit a passage where he needed one of the dead keys from the community center piano. Muscle memory kicked in, and his finger went to avoid a key that wasn't broken on this piano. The rhythm stuttered. For a moment, just a heartbeat, the music faltered. "No," Harold breathed. "Don't stop, please don't stop." Li Wei's eyes flew open. Panic flashed across his face. This was it. The moment where everything would fall apart. Harold had seen it hundreds of times. One mistake leads to another. Confidence crumbles, and suddenly the performance is over. But Li Wei did something extraordinary. He smiled. A tiny, private smile like he was sharing a joke with the piano. His hands found their way back and he dove back into the music with even more intensity than before. The mistake had reminded him he was human, and somehow that made the performance even more powerful. "Did you see that?" Patricia gasped. "He just recovered. Like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Harold said, his voice hoarse. "It was everything." The final minutes of the concerto were approaching, the part Rachmaninoff himself had called the musical equivalent of climbing Everest. Li Wei's thin arms were visibly shaking now from the effort. Sweat ran down his face, dropping onto the keys. His borrowed jacket was soaked through, but his hands never stopped. They flew across the keyboard in patterns that seemed impossible, creating cascades of sound that filled every corner of the old theater. The piano itself seemed to be struggling to keep up with him, its hammers striking strings with machine gun rapidity. In the wings, one of the older stagehands, Jimmy, turned to Big Mike. "I've worked this theater for 35 years, seen every big name you can think of. This is different." "Different how?" "Those big names, they were performing. This kid? He's not performing, I don't know, it's like he's bleeding music." Harold knew exactly what Jimmy meant. There was something raw, unfiltered about Li Wei's playing. The famous pianists he'd heard had spent decades polishing their craft, removing every imperfection, every hint of struggle. Their performances were like diamonds, brilliant, flawless, cold. Li Wei's performance was like lightning, dangerous, unpredictable, absolutely alive. The last passage was coming. Harold found himself gripping his armrests so hard his knuckles went white. This was the part where Rachmaninoff demanded everything: speed, power, precision, all while maintaining the musical line. Many pianists saved their energy for this moment, holding back earlier so they'd have something left. But Li Wei hadn't held anything back. He'd given everything from the first note. Harold couldn't imagine how he'd manage this final climb, while Li Wei's face was pale now, except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheeks. His breathing was audible even from Harold's seat. For a moment his hands hovered over the keys, trembling. Then he took a deep breath, and Harold saw something change in his posture. The exhaustion was still there, but something else too. Determination? No, more than that. Joy. Pure, simple joy. The final passage erupted from the piano like a dam breaking. Li Wei's hands became a blur, but somehow every note was clear, distinct, purposeful. The music built and built, layer upon layer, until it seemed like the old theater walls might crack from the pressure. And then, suddenly, silence. Li Wei's hands fell to his lap. His head dropped forward. His shoulders shook, whether from exhaustion or emotion. Harold couldn't tell. Maybe both. The silence stretched on. 5 seconds. 10. 20. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It was as if the entire theater was under a spell and any sound might break it. High up in the lighting booth, Tommy whispered, "Holy Mother of God." That broke the spell. But still, nobody clapped. They couldn't. They were all trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Harold stood up slowly. His legs felt weak, unstable, like he really had sunk through his chair, through the floor, into some other world. He took one step toward the stage, then another. "Sir?" Li Wei's voice was small, uncertain. "Should I go now?" Harold opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He'd spent 40 years judging music, critiquing performances, deciding who had talent and who didn't. He had words for everything, but not for this. Harold Steinberg stood in the middle of the aisle, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. 40 years of words, and none of them would come. Li Wei sat at the piano bench, small and exhausted, waiting. Finally, Patricia stood up. She walked past Harold, right up to the stage stairs, and climbed them. The clicking of her heels echoed in the silent theater. She approached Li Wei slowly, like you'd approach a spooked animal. She started, then stopped. She tried again. "Where are your parents?" "Working," Li Wei said quietly. They don't know I'm here. They don't know you're auditioning for one of the most prestigious music schools in the country, Lee Dury. Wei shook his head. They think piano is not practical. They want me to focus on math and science, become a doctor or engineer. Patricia's heart broke a little. She looked back at Harold, who still hadn't moved. Harold, she called. Say something. Harold walked to the stage like he was in a dream. He climbed the stairs slowly, his knees protesting. When he reached the piano, he did something nobody expected. He sat down on the bench next to Li Wei. For a moment, they just sat there, the prestigious director in his $1,000 suit, and the kid in borrowed clothes that didn't fit. Show me your hands, Harold said. Li Wei held them out. They were small, still shaking slightly. The fingertips were calloused, harder than any 12-year-old's should be. How many hours? Harold asked. Sorry? How many hours a day do you practice? Lee. We looked down. 4, sometimes 5. Mr. Rodriguez lets me stay late on weekends. Mr. Rodriguez? The janitor at the community center. He gave me a key to the basement. Harold turned Li Wei's hands over, examining them like a doctor. There were tiny scars on the fingertips, places where the skin had split from too much practice and healed over. The piano there, Harold said. Tell me about it. It's old. 3 keys don't work at all. 2 more stick. It hasn't been tuned in years. Harold closed his eyes. The kid had learned Rachmaninoff's third on a broken, out-of-tune piano. It was like learning to paint masterpieces with house paint and newspaper. Tommy, Harold called out suddenly. The lighting director poked his head out of the booth. Yeah, boss? Call the others, the board members. Tell them to get here now. Now? It's 8:30 at night. Now. Tommy disappeared. Harold turned back to Lee. Wei, do you know what you just did? Li Wei shook his head. Neither do I, Harold admitted. And that's the problem. I've spent my whole life thinking I understood music, understood talent. I thought I knew what was possible and what wasn't. He stood up, pacing now. I have students who've been playing since they were 3. They have the best teachers, the best instruments. They practice in soundproof rooms with perfect acoustics. And none of them, not one, could do what you just did. Big Mike had come onto the stage, still wiping his eyes. Kid, I don't know nothing about classical music, but that was something else. More people were gathering. The stage crew, some administrators who'd stayed late, even the security guard had come to see what the fuss was about. Play something else, Harold said suddenly. What? Anything. Play anything else. Li Wei thought for a moment. Then his hands found the keys again. This time it was different. Lighter. A pop song, but transformed into something beautiful and complex. Then it morphed into jazz, then back to classical. A Mozart sonata that somehow flowed perfectly from the jazz progression. He's improvising, Patricia whispered. He's making this up as he goes. Harold laughed. Not his earlier mocking laugh, but something genuine and amazed. Of course he is. He learned on a broken piano. He had to improvise every day just to make music. The board members started arriving. Richard Winters, the chairman, still in his golf clothes. Dorothy Chen, the head of admissions, looking annoyed until she saw Harold's face. What's the emergency? Richard demanded. Sit, Harold said. Just sit and listen. He nodded to Li Wei, who looked overwhelmed by all the people suddenly filling the theater. The Rachmaninoff again, Harold said gently. Just the third movement. Can you? Li Wei looked at his hands, exhausted and sore. Then he looked at Harold and nodded. As the music filled the theater again, Harold watched the board members' faces change. Richard's irritation melted into shock. Dorothy's hand went to her mouth. Even crusty old Professor Hendricks, who hadn't smiled since 1987, looked like he might cry. When Li Wei finished, the silence was shorter this time. Then Richard stood up and did something Harold had never seen him do in 20 years. He applauded. One by one, they all stood. The board members, the staff, the crew. They clapped until their hands hurt, until the sound filled the old theater like thunder. Li Wei sat on the bench looking confused and a little scared. Harold raised his hand for silence. We need to discuss something, privately. He looked at Li Wei. Wait here. Patricia, stay with him. The board members huddled in the back of the theater. Harold could see Richard gesturing wildly, Dorothy nodding, Professor Hendricks actually smiling. Patricia sat next to Li Wei. Are you hungry? A little. She pulled a granola bar from her purse. It's not much. Li Wei ate it in 3 bites. Patricia realized he probably hadn't eaten dinner. Tell me about your parents, she said. They work hard. They came here with nothing. Just a suitcase and me. They want better for me. That's why. He trailed off. Why they want you to be a doctor? He nodded. Music doesn't pay bills, my father says. Music is luxury for rich people. Patricia wanted to argue, but she knew he was partly right. How many talented musicians never made it? How many ended up teaching piano to uninterested kids for $40 an hour? But then she thought about what she'd just witnessed. This wasn't just talent, this was something else entirely. Harold was walking back, the board members behind him. His face was serious. Li Wei, he said formally, the Manhattan School of Performing Arts would like to offer you a full scholarship. Not just tuition, everything. Books, housing, meals, even a stipend for your family to make up for any income they might lose. Li Wei's eyes went wide. I don't understand. We want you to come to our school. We want to teach you. Although, Harold laughed, I'm not sure what we could teach you that you haven't already figured out yourself. But my parents, we'll talk to them. I'll talk to them personally. I'll explain what you have, what it means. Harold knelt down so he was eye level with Li Wei. This is a gift, not just talent. Anyone can have talent. This is something else. And it would be a crime to let it go undeveloped. Richard stepped forward. We're also proposing something unprecedented. A new program inspired by you. We're going to partner with community centers across the city. Find kids like you who don't have access to traditional training. Give them instruments, teachers, opportunity. Li Wei looked overwhelmed. Because of me. Because you've shown us we've been looking in the wrong places, Harold said. We've been so focused on finding the next great pianist in the usual spots. Wealthy families, connected circles. We forgot that music doesn't care about any of that. Dorothy added, we'd also like to offer Mr. Rodriguez a position as a community liaison. Someone told us he's the one who gave you the chance. We'd like him to help us find more kids who need chances. Li Wei's eyes filled with tears. He's going to be so happy. His grandmother, she was a pianist, but she had to stop. He always says music saved his life after she died. Harold felt that twist in his chest again. How many stories like this had he missed? How many Li Weis had he dismissed without a second thought? There's one more thing, Harold said. The piano at the community center. We're replacing it. A new Steinway. And we're creating a practice room there free for any child who wants to learn. Now Li Wei was really crying. Not delicate tears, but full 12-year-old kid sobs. Patricia pulled him into a hug, and he clung to her like a life raft. Thank you, he whispered. Thank you. Harold looked at his watch. It's late. How are you? Getting home? Subway, then bus? Absolutely not. Harold pulled out his phone. I'm calling you a car, and I'm coming with you. We need to talk to your parents tonight. Tonight? Tonight. Because tomorrow your life changes, and they need to understand why. As they prepared to leave, Tommy called down from the lighting booth. Hey, boss. I recorded the whole thing on the theater cameras. You want me to save it? Harold looked at Li Wei, then back at Tommy. Save it. Save everything. Someday, when he's playing at Carnegie Hall, we'll want to remember this night. The night a kid taught us what music really means. 25 years later, the same theater was packed. Not an empty seat in the house. Outside, people who couldn't get tickets stood in the rain, watching on screens that had been set up in the lobby. The announcement had gone out just a week ago. Li Wei was coming home. Harold Steinberg, now 83, sat in the same red velvet seat he'd occupied that night so long ago. His hair was white now, his hands spotted with age, but his eyes were still sharp. Patricia sat beside him, retired but still beautiful, still carrying that same clipboard out of habit. "Nervous?" she asked. "Why would I be nervous? I'm not the one performing," but his hands were shaking slightly. She pretended not to notice. The lights dimmed. A man walked onto the stage, tall, confident, wearing a perfectly fitted tuxedo. Li Wei at 37 looked nothing like the skinny kid in borrowed clothes. But when he smiled, Harold saw that 12-year-old boy again. "Good evening," Li Wei said, his voice carrying easily through the theater. 25 years ago, I stood on this stage for the first time. I was terrified. I was wearing a suit that belonged to my neighbor's son, and shoes with holes in them. I had learned to play piano in a basement, on an instrument that was more furniture than musical instrument. Soft laughter rippled through the audience. That night changed my life, but more importantly, it changed many lives. He looked directly at Harold. "There's someone here tonight who I need to thank. Harold Steinberg gave me more than a scholarship. He gave me belief, in myself, in the power of music, in the idea that talent can come from anywhere." Harold felt his eyes water. Damn it. Not here, not in front of everyone. "But before I play tonight," Li Wei continued, "I want to show you something." The curtain behind him rose. Instead of an orchestra, there were 30 young people ages 8 to 18 sitting at keyboards. Some were dressed nicely, others in jeans and t-shirts. They were black, white, Asian, Latino, a perfect picture of the city itself. "These are students from the Rodriguez Chen Foundation," Li Wei said. "Kids who, like me, didn't have access to traditional music education. Kids who were told that classical music wasn't for them." In the third row, Harold spotted a familiar face. Mr. Rodriguez, now in his 80s, wearing a suit for probably the third time in his life. He was crying openly, not caring who saw. "Tonight, they're going to play with me. We're doing something that's never been done before." Rachmaninoff's Third, arranged for 31 pianos. Gasps from the audience. It was insane. Impossible. Exactly the kind of thing Li Wei would do. Li Wei sat at the lead piano, the same Steinway he'd played that first night. The theater had never gotten rid of it. Too much history. "This is for every kid who was told they couldn't," Li Wei said. "For every parent working 3 jobs to give their children a chance. For every teacher who sees potential where others see problems. And for Harold Steinberg, who taught me that sometimes the best thing you can do is throw away the rule book." He raised his hands. 30 young pianists did the same. The first note rang out. Not from Li Wei's piano, but from an 8-year-old girl in the back row. Then another child added their part, then another. It was like watching a musical conversation, each young pianist adding their voice to the story. When Li Wei finally joined in, the sound was overwhelming. Not 31 people playing the same thing, but 31 parts of a whole, each essential, each unique. The arrangement was brilliant. Simpler parts for the younger kids, complex passages for the advanced students, all woven together into something that somehow worked. Harold leaned forward, amazed. This wasn't just a performance, it was a statement. All these kids from community centers and public housing, from families that couldn't afford lessons, they were playing Rachmaninoff. They were owning it. Halfway through, Li Wei stood up from his piano, still playing with one hand, and walked among the students. He'd whisper encouragement to one, adjust another's hand position, smile at a third who was struggling with a passage. He wasn't just performing, he was teaching, right there, on stage. One boy, probably 10 years old, froze during his solo section. His hands hovered over the keys, panic in his eyes. The music started to fall apart. Li Wei was there in an instant. He sat beside the boy, played the passage with him until the child found his courage again. The audience held its breath, then erupted in applause when the boy successfully finished his part. "That's what it's about," Harold whispered to Patricia. "Not perfection, courage." The final movement was approaching. Li Wei returned to his piano, but now the students were different. They weren't just playing notes anymore. They were telling their stories. Each face showed the same intensity, the same joy that Li Wei had shown all those years ago. The last section, that impossible climb that had nearly broken Li Wei as a child, was distributed among all of them. Each pianist played a portion, like runners in a relay race passing the musical baton. It shouldn't have worked. Too many transitions, too many chances for error. But it was magnificent. The music built and built, 31 pianos creating a wall of sound that made the walls shake. The audience was on its feet before the last note even finished. The silence after was brief. Then the theater exploded. Standing ovation didn't describe it. People were cheering, crying, hugging strangers. Harold saw Richard Winters, ancient now but still chairman, pumping his fist in the air like he was at a football game. Li Wei stood and gestured for the students to bow. They did, giggling and elbowing each other, still kids despite what they'd just accomplished. "Wait," Li Wei said into the microphone. "We're not done." The audience settled back down. "Mr. Rodriguez," Li Wei called out. "Would you come up here, please?" The old janitor shook his head vigorously, but the people around him started pushing him toward the aisle. Finally, he made his way to the stage, slow and embarrassed. Li Wei met him at the stairs, helped him up. This man gave a lonely kid a key to a basement. That simple act of kindness created all of this. He gestured to the students. "Mr. Rodriguez, these kids wanted to play something for you." The students returned to their keyboards. This time, the music was different, simple, beautiful. Clair de Lune. But arranged so each student played just a few notes, creating the melody together like a musical constellation. Mr. Rodriguez stood in the center of the stage, tears streaming down his weathered face. When the music ended, he spoke into the microphone Li Wei offered him. "My grandmother," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She always said music was like love. The more you give away, the more you have." He looked at the students. "You kids, you got so much love. Don't ever let anyone tell you different." As the evening wound down, Harold made his way backstage. He found Li Wei surrounded by students, parents, and reporters. "Excuse me," Harold said. "Might I borrow our star for a moment?" They stepped outside, into the alley behind the theater. The same alley where Harold used to smoke between acts back when he smoked. Now it was just him and Li Wei, and the sound of rain on the dumpsters. "You did it," Harold said. "We did it," Li Wei corrected. "You took a chance on me." "No," Harold shook his head. "I almost didn't. I was laughing at you, remember? Mocking you. If you hadn't started playing. But I did play, and you listened. Really listened. That's all any of us wants, isn't it? Someone to really listen." Harold was quiet for a moment. "I'm retiring next year. Officially this time. The board wants to know who I think should replace me as director." Li Wei started to shake his head, but Harold held up a hand. "Not to run the school, to run the foundation, to find more kids like you were, to give them keys to basements, chances, to play, someone who'll listen. Harold, I have concerts, recordings, commitments, and you'll keep them. But in between, you'll do this. Because this is what matters. Not the performances at Lincoln Center or the recordings that win Grammys. This." He gestured toward the theater where the students were still celebrating. "This is your real music." Li Wei looked through the stage door at the kids packing up their keyboards, laughing, taking selfies with their families. One little girl was playing the opening of Rachmaninoff's Third on her keyboard, struggling but determined. "Okay," he said. Simply, Harold smiled. "Good. Oh, and one more thing, that comment I made that night about sinking through my chair. Yeah? I was wrong. I didn't sink. I rose. We all did. You lifted us up, Li Wei. You're still lifting us up." They stood together in the rain, the old teacher and his greatest student, listening to the sound of young voices and laughter from inside. Somewhere in that group was another Li Wei, another kid who just needed someone to listen. The music continued. It always did.